Yep, that's right. Okay, so the 7 habits of highly effective atheists. What I really want to talk about is how we ought to behave as atheists. So this is obviously aimed at atheists, but I hope it will give religious people, theists, kind of insight into why atheists behave as they do, ones like me at least. Okay, so obviously it's not an attempt to create a dogmatic blueprint, but rather to explore how we should conduct ourselves in relation to some of the main issues thrown out by atheism. And I'm arguing from the point of view that atheists have a moral duty to be active and campaigning. So my points are informed by that. Okay, so the first habit is to avoid smugness. If the cardinal sin of the religious in relating to others is self-righteousness, then the cardinal sin of atheism is smugness. Having worked out that there isn't a God doesn't make you particularly special, and it certainly doesn't give you a license to feel intellectually superior to anybody else. Examples I'm thinking of might be the Brights. I don't think Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins, who are two of the organisation's most prominent members, are particularly smug in themselves, but I think it displays kind of particular detachment from public perception of atheism, that they chose a name for their organisation that seems to suggest an innate higher intelligence of those who have a naturalistic worldview. And I think public perception of atheism is important if we want to win people over, as well as the fact that being smug is just really irritating. So this brings me on to my second point. I think we ought to proselytize. We ought to be evangelists for atheism. So there's a lot of disagreement about that, but about whether we ought to pursue the conversion of others to atheism. But even if you don't agree with the assessment originally made by Shelley that atheism is a moral necessity, that religion is actually a damaging and a bad thing, then you probably at least agree that there is a certain value in the truth in itself, and that the more truth there is, the truthier our society becomes, the better. I also disagree with the assessment that something is wrong with trying to deconvert people. I have little problem with evangelists for religion, because I think that the free and frank exchange of ideas is very important, whatever those ideas are. And also, I have seen plenty of people, personally, who've been religious and then after discussing their beliefs with atheists have changed their minds. It is probably best not to be too aggressive in evangelizing, though, about atheism. Its prime virtues are its rationalism and openness, and that ought to be the spirit by which we engage other people. While you might not feel people's beliefs deserve a great deal of respect, they will, and making them angry is only going to make things worse. If you believe your argument makes more sense, lay it out calmly and rationally, and don't give them ammunition to call you just as bad as a fundamentalist preacher. H.P. Lovecraft, when confronted by religious arguments, responded, "Bah, pardon the bah, I feel several bahs, but out of courtesy I say only one." So I think we should follow his example. Again, this leads me into my next point. The third habit, treating religious people with respect, but not necessarily treating their opinions with respect. As has been said, we ought to be civil to anybody who we engage in debate with. Offending people just for the sake of it is pointless. But this doesn't mean that we ought to give their opinions special leeway. If we believe what somebody says is patently false, then we ought to treat what they say as such. Richard Dawkins frequently rails against the special protection given to religious views, saying that they are no more respectable than believing there are fairies at the bottom of our gardens. If we agree with him, we should be prepared to say so, because if we aren't prepared to take off the kid gloves that many people wear when handling religion, we will never undermine the special protection and status that religion has in society. So don't go out of your way to offend people, but don't pull any punches to avoid offending them. The fourth habit is knowing what you're talking about. Plenty of people become atheists for perfectly decent reasons, but never really explore the arguments and counter-arguments between theists and atheists, or the accompanying history, science, statistics, and so on behind it. Doing so will not only help you more closely define the kind of atheist you are and where you stand on the major issues, it will arm you against the arguments of theists, the more sophisticated of which I think are often forms of sophistry and logic chopping that are difficult to understand but still essentially flawed. Also, it's just really interesting. On a more personal level, the fifth habit is to define your own project, as Tim has just been talking about. Define your own purpose. I am including it, even though it's already been talking about, because I think it's one of the most important habits. For many religious people, their religion defines to a great extent who they are. It provides them with purpose, meaning, and a sense of being valuable as a person, as well as providing a ready-made sense of community. Many atheists, especially those who have lost their faith, find the absence of this a problem and can often feel as if empty, as if something is missing in their lives. I do fall into this camp of reluctant atheists who wish they could bring themselves to believe something, but I think there is also some truth in Christopher Hitchens' assertion that living in a world with God would be like living in a celestial North Korea where your every thought and action is recorded. So perhaps the most important part of becoming an atheist is the need to define your own purpose, your own value, and find an alternative community to be part of. For the convert, it can also be the most exciting because everything you choose is now on your own terms. The sixth habit is something that I feel is often not given enough attention. That is campaigning for atheism and secularism, particularly abroad. In the same way that organisations like Amnesty International protect and fight for human rights abroad, despite the fact that human rights abuses are relatively rare in this country, I feel that atheists and secularists ought to fight and campaign against the abuses of religious power abroad. Saying I'm passionate about human rights would normally be considered something admirable, but saying I'm passionate about secularism would normally just elicit blank stares. Why is this? Perhaps people feel that fighting for human rights has already been covered. Fighting for human rights already has abuses of human rights in the name of religion covered. But we don't use this argument, for example, against campaigning feminist groups who do important work campaigning against the brutalization and oppression of women. We have to fight our own corner as atheists around the world, not just in our own country. We can find common cause with these groups, particularly feminists, as theocracies are responsible in large part for the relegation of women to second-class citizens in many countries. Just pointing out the excesses of these regimes as an academic argument against religion is not enough. For instance, the status of apostates and women in Saudi Arabia, of gay people in Iran, of religious violence in Nigeria, India, and Israel are all directly linked to the power of religion, and we need to be active against that. Jonathan Miller, for example, says he finds it strange to call himself an atheist, in the same way he would find it strange to give a particular special name to his absence of belief in the tooth fairy. But Christopher Hitchens responds to this by saying that those who believe in the tooth fairy are not executing those who don't. This is why we give a name to atheism, because not being a theist has important consequences. And lastly, not because I've run out of other things to say, but join Warwick Atheists or the National Secular Society or the Brights if you must, because organisations like these are great for campaigning, great for debate, and just for meeting like-minded people. So sign up. Thank you.